We're joined from New Delhi by Professor Makku Sanwa, who is also a former director at the United Nations Climate Change Secretariat. Mr. Sanwa, both China and India have been trying very hard to cut down on the consumption of fossil fuel, especially coal. But we have to admit, for both countries, coal is cheap, and both countries have a large supply of coal. So it is not difficult to wean the countries off coal supply and consumption.
That's right. You see, I think we should look at this, the global warming or the use of coal, in terms of a continuum. The United States was the first country to industrialize and urbanize. China is following the steps of the United States and Europe and Japan, and India is 10 to 15 years behind China. So we see that in the use of coal, which is a fundamental source of energy for manufacturing, industrialization, urbanization. United States per capita consumption of coal is more than 2 times that of China. India is 1/5 that of the United States. But the key issue here is that while the United States coal use is nearly stabilizing, China is also stabilizing. India's coal use is going to double in the next 20 years because it is 1/5 China's level. So I think the first thing we need to see is this as a continuum of countries moving from agriculture to industry to urbanization. And the United States, we must remember, Europe and Japan, 75% of their population was living in cities in 1970. China hopes to achieve that in the next 5 years, and India 10 to 15 years later. So that's the first point, because as we develop, the link between not only industrialization, infrastructure, but also human well-being is clear. Now, what is the difficulty that China and India are facing? They have huge population. China's population is 4 times that of the United States, even though its per capita income is half. India's population is equal to that of China, but consumption is 1/5 that of the United States. But what China and India are really doing is that despite the fact that they are still developing countries, they are moving away from the pattern of coal use or energy use that was followed by the United States, Europe, and Japan earlier on. For example, the use of renewable energy is being pushed very hard by both China and India. The use of public transport is much more in China and India than in the United States. The United States has hardly any public transport. The average ownership of cars is 1.5 per individual. China and India, it is much less than that, maybe a third. And the future, again, the urbanization, it is not huge, sprawling urban conglomerations where people live outside in suburbs, but more dense population with smaller houses. Now, the impact here is that when you have smaller houses and dense populations and public transport, you use less gasoline or fuel for automobiles. And it has been projected that fuel use in automobiles likely to be 50% of global greenhouse emissions in 2050 if present trends continue. So those trends are not continuing in China and India. Similarly with urbanization, dense houses, the trends that characterize the increase of greenhouse gas emissions in the United States, Europe, and Japan are not there in China and India. Similarly, the use of the wastage of food. 1/3 of the food is wasted in the United States. Most of it is processed. And that again is energy intensive. In China and India, they have more fresh fruits and it's less processed, local. So the lifestyle is different.
So now, you're saying that both India and China have been trying very hard, but you still have to admit that among the 20 most polluted cities in the world, almost the majority are in China or India. So what programs BRIC countries are now working on to improve the life quality for both China, India, and other BRIC nations?
See, I said that they are trying very hard, but it is difficult because what they are doing has not been done in the West so far. They are basically charting a new course of human well-being in a different way, using energy in a very different way to that has been used before. And that can be seen in the air pollution example that you have just asked me to talk about. You see, the air pollution is different to greenhouse gases. The link is the use of transport. It is in nitrogen oxide that come out particularly from diesel fuels that cause the local smogs. And also coal plants and other industry. Now what is happening is that China is shifting its growth strategy from manufacturing and infrastructure intensive to consumption, which means that the focus will again shift from heavy industry around cities to to services and other ways of economic growth. Similarly, India is getting very conscious now about urban pollution because of the health impacts and taking efforts to push public transport in a very big way. And also to have curbs on cars, particularly the SUVs. Now here is a place again that China and India are facing problems, because in China half the cars are going to be SUVs as in India. But again, the governments are looking at a very different solution to that in the West by saying by 2030, 2040, all new cars will be electric cars. So the efforts are on, the difficulty is there because human well-being is dependent on increasing use of energy, and both these countries are charting very new courses.
So we have to think smart and do
which are
smart.
different to the trajectory of growth that had been followed.
Mr. Sanwa, for your analysis.
That's right.